Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today I've got a really special guest. I'm excited. We're going to be diving into his research around psychosis and autism, the links with all the neurotransmitters and the environment and vaccines. So I'm putting my pharmacist hat back on today and I love having these chats. So welcome Dr. Christian Bogner. How are you, mate?
I'm doing very well, Alex. Thank you so much. It's late here in Detroit, but we just won against the Knicks. So it's 3-2 in the playoffs. I just watched that and I'm like, oh my God, I have to talk to Alex. So that's why I look like this, tired. It's been a long day, but it's a pleasure to be on. I didn't want to miss this. So
I appreciate it. We'll punch through all these topics and condense it for you so it's not too late. But for those that aren't familiar with your work, do you want to maybe give us the quick, your background, qualifications, and what led you to where you are now?
okay, great. Well, I studied medicine in Europe. I'm from Germany. And I came to the US. I worked in a surgical specialty as an OBGYN for 12 years. It was a great job, but I have a son. He's currently 20. He was diagnosed with autism when he was 2. And so I couldn't stop researching because I didn't get any help from mainstream medicine. So I started to dive in. I didn't learn anything about autism in medical school. So for the next 12 years, I couldn't help myself but just focus on autism and not on OBGYN. And so about 7 years ago, I got my functional medicine certification and started to counsel parents from all over the world in regards to autism. I have about 1,100 patients in my practice, and I have learned a lot from my wonderful parents about their children. And yeah, it's been a great journey. I've have a great colleague I've met along my journey from Tucson. His name is Alex Saunders. I've partnered up with him about 4 years ago, and there's not a day that passes that we don't talk at least 3-4 times a day about autism, and that's our life, Monday to Sunday. Very engaged with the community, with our patients, and we just want to help and find solutions that are feasible because there's too much chatter about vaccines, but not a lot of talk about what can we do for the injured.
Yes.
And so that's what we do. The most severe cases that you can get, and we get them better, and we have great results. Especially over the last 3 years, I would say it's been a rough road. As you know, autism is the ultimate disease to treat. From very many aspects. Look at it, but yeah, we've made some great discoveries, and we're on a great path, I think, to offer protocols and solutions. We started a company because we discovered a very interesting molecule about 3 years ago, which led us to form a company, and now we're actually developing very clean nutraceuticals, powders that are geared towards nourishing the microbiome and support detoxification. And we have 23 products. It's called Researched Elements. We started a foundation, nonprofit, to support families in need, to support them through the biomedical journey, and just in general to raise the awareness that autism is biomedical. That's why we named our foundation Autism is Biomedical.
Yeah.
And so we're supporting some patients there. And the difference to the other foundations is that every patient that we sponsor will have a video of their progress. So once they start going through the journey, and then we interview them afterwards to let them speak about their journey of what they have observed. And we're currently also developing lasers, cold lasers, red photon therapy,
Yeah.
where we see incredible results as well. And yeah, it's we're involved with some of the kids that have telepathic abilities. I'm not sure if you've heard of the telepathy tapes, but
Yeah.
Dr. Powell is on our board of Autism's Biomedical. She's the neuropsychiatrist that was involved in that podcast, but she actually has studied autistic savants since the 1980s and has written a book about ESP, and is very much interested in the mechanisms of telepathy and these types of phenomena in these children.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, I think a lot of people are waking up to this, and it's more acceptable to have these conversations, and a lot of it's getting censored less as well. So many, I think, health professionals have woken up since COVID, especially. We've covered the telepathy tapes in previous episodes, but for those that haven't seen that series, it basically goes into some of these kids that have these telepathic and extrasensory perception abilities, and actually are extremely intelligent once you have the ability to be able to communicate with them. So, with your research and that type of thing, what I guess for people at home is the traditional stance of the medical industry that we've both been through still to date as the sort of cause of autism, with RFK putting out the most recent numbers the other day, 1 in 12 kids now, I think, was in California. But do you want to get into, is it, aluminium or adjuvants in those vaccines? Is it environmental? I know you've done research about mold and other things, or you mentioned the gut microbiome, combination of all these things, or what do you think is that cause? And then how did that lead you to go about treating these things?
Yeah, great question. It's a big one. Well, I would say out of the 1,100 patients that I have, I have very extensive intakes. And one of my questions is always asking the parent, what do you think is the cause of your child's autism? I would say most of them had their children develop normally until a specific point. Usually it's between, at the around 18-month age, and then there's a regression. And so I would say about 90+% of all parents report that a vaccine must have been involved because it was right around the time of the shot, either right after when they had fevers, some of them seizures. And you can see, the kind of sequence of event, how they went to their doctor and they said, no, it's not related. And they said it's normal and then just give Tylenol. And then those that have a more gradual regression over the next several months after the vaccination, but still 90+%, you can't ignore that from 1,100 parents,
Yeah.
And however, I do have some patients that have never received a vaccine or there was no vaccines involved in pregnancy. And you have to ask yourself, is it really the only reason? I do myself believe, yes, it's a top trigger, but that's the key word. It's a trigger. How come we have a child regress at 18 months and they still have autism at the age of 40, 50, 60? What is the mechanism that keeps that going? Is it aluminum in the brain? I'm could be. I mean, we had the brain autopsies of Chris Exley in the UK that showed aluminum in every autistic child, higher than they've ever seen in any Alzheimer autopsies. However, I do believe there are different mechanisms involved with that. And, I do believe there's a very strong correlation with the microbiome, but also, of course, genetics, because we have evidence that, well, it's up to 90% of children with autism have gut issues, right? One way or the other. We think it's all the kids. But anyway, based on the data that's out there, up to 90%. But then you have to realize there's many, many kids walking around that have gut issues that don't have autism. And some kids have ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and IBD, and they don't have autism. So it can't be the only thing that they just have dysbiosis and leaky gut. So what we've discovered 3 years ago was a particular molecule. It's called sodium thiosulfate. I'm not sure if you've heard of it or not.
Yeah.
It's a molecule. It's known to humans for 300 years. It's been discovered, and it's actually was approved by the FDA here in the US in 1939 for the poisoning of cyanide. So cyanide poisoning, sodium thiosulfate. And so 80 plus years later, today, it's still the treatment of choice for cyanide poisoning. And so we stumbled upon this molecule, and we saw very quick results with our patients. So more eye contact, more awareness, often at the same day of the administration. And so once we got these reports back from my clientele and from my colleague, Alex Saunders, we wanted to study everything about it. How does it work? Why is it doing this? Why is it doing this so quick? And what we found was rather astounding. The principal mechanism, of course, it's approved for cyanide poisoning. It helps with the metabolism of cyanide to thiocyanide, which is excretable through the kidneys.
Yeah.
But first we thought there's no way this is possible, right? There's no cyanide poisoning in autism. So then we kept looking, and what we found was that it had to do with the glutathione cycle. And as you know, glutathione is it's a tripeptide, right? It's a glycine, glutamate, cysteine peptide, and most of it is in the liver, right? So if you have leaky gut, the issue is, right, a lot of toxins coming in, mold toxins, industrial chemicals, heavy metals, LPS, ammonia, all of these things are coming in. And so the liver's function is to prevent that all of these compounds make it into the circulating blood. And that's why we have one of the major mechanisms in the liver to detoxify is the conjugation to glutathione, right? So glutathione binds the toxin.
Yeah.
What it does actually is the glutathione gives the sulfur ion to the toxin to make it less negatively charged, to make it excretable, mostly through the kidneys, right? Water soluble. But that leaves the glutathione without the sulfur ion, and now it's what we call oxidized, right? And oxidized glutathione is like a car that has no gas. It's there, but it doesn't work. And so oxidized glutathione, we know, is very high in autism, and it's also very high in anybody who has chronic inflammation. The available glutathione is low, the oxidized is very high.
Just for people at home with the leaky gut, for people that don't understand, the idea is that if you don't have healthy, tight cells in your intestines and whatnot, through inflammation or other, environmental toxins or whatever, you kind of get these gaps where more toxins and particles can leak in that aren't digested or transported into the bloodstream and the liver via the normal passages.
Yeah, and I'll get into that exactly how that works, of why that happens. But in particular, to get back to the glutathione, the problem that we saw is that it's not that we need more glutathione. Because if you add glutathione, we often saw clinically that the kids were just starting to bounce off the walls, right? They were going nuts. And many said, oh, they're detoxing. Well, that doesn't make any sense. The function of glutathione is to bind toxins and to reduce free radicals. Why would it make you more crazy? Yeah. And so what we found is that the higher you go with the oxidized levels of glutathione, the more that actually inhibits methylation. And methylation, as you know, is a process. It's needed in 300 plus chemical reactions. Some very notable ones are the reduction of histamine, the reduction of dopamine. And so if you raise the oxidized level, you have higher dopamine, higher histamine. Histamine causes, hyperactivity, inability to sleep, brain fog, eczema. And then the dopamine, of course, obviously, racing thoughts all the way up into the schizophrenic realms. And so what we discovered is actually that there's a defect in those individuals with chronic inflammation or autism in regards to recycling the glutathione back to, available glutathione. Yeah. And the sodium thiosulfate can do that. And that was one of the mechanisms we found, that sodium thiosulfate recycles glutathione. And that was pretty incredible. And it works very fast. The other mechanisms that we found it does, besides the cyanide and glutathione recycling, is that it binds heavy metals. It binds mercury, binds arsenic, nickel, lead, some other metals. Actually, it's used in kids with cancer who receive cisplatin-based chemotherapy. The platinum-based chemotherapy is very toxic to the auditory nerve, and they have hearing loss from the chemo. So 8 hours after the chemo, it's approved to give IV to cancer kids to prevent hearing loss, and it's very effective. There are also studies that show that sodium thiosulfate is cardioprotective and neuroprotective. It's a very strong antioxidant. It's actually a GRAS, generally recognized as safe in the oral form. So it's a very safe compound. We have an 80-year history of IV use, so it's very safe. And so we developed it into a lotion, and it's very effective. So that was one thing that we discovered, which inspired us. Hey, we can do more. Let's find out more. So that's one thing that was really great for our patients, that made a huge difference in my practice and in Alex's practice. But nevertheless, that was one mechanism to kind of stop all of the stuff coming in and kind of keep the blood clean. So we saw improvement. But that didn't stop and didn't treat the gut, because that's what we believe is the source of continuous toxin production. That's why you can see somebody still autistic at the age of 60. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, why did these kids have this defect in the recycling of the glutathione? And the reason is that naturally the body uses NADPH to do that. And NADPH is not something that you can take in a supplement. It's actually very difficult for the body to produce it. It's a niacin-based enzyme. And where is it? Why is it not there? Why is it not recycling the glutathione? And the reason is that NADPH is recycling glutathione, but it also has an affinity to reduce superoxide, which is a free radical. So it's basically, if there's a fire, it wants to rather go put out the fire before it wants to prevent, right? Build glutathione and then prevent more inflammation.
Yeah.
And where's the inflammation coming from? And the inflammation is coming from the initial trigger. May it be vaccines, may it be glyphosate, may it be a dysbiosis caused by antibiotics. And so we believe that the vaccines are a trigger that pushes somebody that's susceptible over the edge and lock them into chronic inflammation. Because if the NADPH is sucked up, and if you have no backup mechanism to recycle glutathione, and by backup mechanism, I mean our own production of thiosulfate, we can produce it. That's what we found out. And that has to do with sulfation defects in children, with the SUOX gene, sulfide oxidase gene that converts sulfites to sulfates, as well as arsenic toxicity. So all of these things make you susceptible to a trigger not snapping out of it. That's how we believe the mechanism is. However, now we see, still that original problem that's in the gut, the continuous production of toxins. And my colleague Alex, for the last 4 years, has analyzed stool samples from children with autism. And it's a special stool test. It's called a 16S V4 RNA test. It's a sequencing test. And what it does, it measures basically the entire ecosystem of bacteria, not just 30 or 40, how many of us functional doctors used to do, and they show you what's high and what's low, and none of us knew, what are you going to do with high Pseudomonas or high staph? What, you're going to give them antibiotics? No. So this test shows you all of the bacteria that are cataloged in the libraries that we have in the pipelines from the universities. And he developed a software that taps into all of these databases, 4 databases. No other stool test has that, and gives you an exact idea of which bacteria are elevated and which ones are not. And with all of this information, what we have seen now, or what my colleague Alex has seen, does the stool test. He sees what's high and what's low. What's low is usually lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. What's high is usually the gram negatives, right? We have Bacteroides, Klebsiella, we have Clostridia, and all of these bacteria that they should be maybe 5%, but they're at 50%. Okay. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out this is not normal, right? And many of them are so high because the bifidio is low. We see bifidio at less than 0.01% when it should be 20%. And why is that important? Because bifidobacteria sets the pH in the gut. It's like the temperature in your fridge. If the temperature is too high, more bacteria will grow. And if bifidio is not there, well, the gram negatives come in. And why is that important? It's important because we see it over and over and over that in these children, we have such high levels of Bacteroides and Prevotella and Clostridia. And why is that important? It's because these bacteria are able to do 2 major things that we have seen correlations with autism very, very much. One is the overproduction of LPS, lipopolysaccharide. As you know, gram-negative bacteria in their cell wall have this little molecule in there called LPS. And when they shed, the LPS is actually the molecule that causes leaky gut. It punches a hole in the gut. And then all of these things make it in there into the liver, overwhelming the liver that's not able to bind it, right? Because we don't have the glutathione there. And so they make it into the blood. There are about 50 studies that have linked LPS to autism, involved in autism. In fact, in the laboratory research setting, they use LPS to induce seizures into rats. If you want to have a seizing rat, they have exact protocols of how much LPS you need to inject into them so they have a seizure. But it's been linked to seizures. It's been linked to activating mast cells to release histamine. It's been linked to suppress the T cell immune system, immunosuppressive and immunostimulatory on the other, kind of allergic kind of response. And then you have all of these cytokine elevations, interleukin 6, TNF alpha, interleukin 1 beta, and all of these are known to cause inflammation of the brain, specifically the amygdala, and cause neuroinflammation. They cause, in microglial cells, the cells that connect neurons and disconnect them and organize the brain. The microglial cells have these arms stick out. There's this receptor called TLR4, toll-like receptor 4, which it activates, and it's also been shown to be, activated in autism. And so that's the one mechanism that we believe is causing the motor neuron dysfunction, which makes the kids not speak, basically. It shuts that system down. That's one. The other very interesting mechanism that I'm very interested in is the serotonin aspect. So as you know, 95% of serotonin is produced in the human body in the microbiome. It's kind of steered by bacteria. Only 5% is produced in the brain. And as you know, serotonin comes from tryptamine. Tryptamine comes from tryptophan, from foods like turkey, chicken, cheese, and some other things, some other food groups, of course. And the tryptophan gets converted to tryptamine, and tryptamine to serotonin. And if you now have a bacteria that's at 50% when it should be 5%, 10 times higher than it should be, you can imagine the amounts of serotonin and tryptamines that get released into the circulation. And what are the effects of that? Is the question. I used to do neurotransmitter testing. I don't do that anymore. For about 4 years, urinary neurotransmitter, where we measured GABA, glutamate, adrenaline, serotonin, dopamine, and then all the precursors of those and the breakdown products. So we knew exactly, what's high, what's low. Is there an issue with the genes breaking them down? And I tell you, almost every patient that I've seen had high levels of tryptamine and high levels of serotonin in the urine. And back then, I didn't really understand what the heck, why.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets really interesting. First of all, we know that serotonin is not the happy hormone, right? It's kind of a paradox. Serotonin in higher levels, if you go too high, it causes some nausea. Anxiety is a big one. A lot of people are anxious. It's serotonin. Then you have more the OCD type behaviors. Then you get into panic attacks, schizophrenic realms, and then autism. The higher you go, the more you are drifting off into a parallel universe, it seems, because as you know, tryptamines and serotonin, they're psychoactive. They can cause psychosis. Many studies involved in schizophrenia research and autism. But yeah, that still didn't necessarily explain the thing that you want to talk about, I know. But what we see from elevations of serotonin and it's OCD type behaviors, and especially hyperactivity, is driven by serotonin and the OCD. And in the periphery, serotonin actually works as a vasoconstrictor. So you have a lot of kids with rapid heartbeats, cold hand, cold feet, almost synesthesia, almost like, you don't feel because of the less blood flow. And you have a lot of kids, like want to feel something, because of those effects. Seizures are involved with serotonin elevations, serotonin syndrome or LPS elevations. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell of what we think is driving all of this. There are a lot more toxins, of course, that get produced. There's ammonia, there are oxalates, there's histamine, a whole bunch of other things that get produced by these bacteria. But those are the main ones. And what my colleague Alex has been doing is he measures the microbiome, and then he looks at all of the abundances. He developed a software that shows you what's too high and what's too low. And then based on evidence-based research, for example, Saccharomyces boulardii, a beneficial yeast, lowers Clostridium, or berberin reduces bacteroids. And that's all evidence-based. And so over 6 weeks, it develops a plan. All right, take these things Monday to Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. He develops a plan. And after 6 weeks of taking all of these things, of reducing the bad ones and feeding the good ones with fibers and prebiotics and PHGG and GOS fibers, known things that grow bifidio and lactobacillus, and certain probiotics too. He measures it again and sees what difference has this plan made for this patient, and then at the same time measure behavioral outcomes, like huge questionnaires. Do you sleep better? Do you poop better? What do you see? Do you see improvement? And doing this over and over and over 2,000 times, that he has done now over 4 or 5 years almost, we have pretty good data. So we just written a 36-page case review of about 219 patients who answered that questionnaire, and looked at their microbiome changes. And we found that 98.5% of all of these families would recommend it to a friend to do it again, and 90+% of patients saw improvement with this method. So obviously over time it has improved. He saw, hey, this is working, this is not working, this is changing, this bacteria, this is not. And so a lot of clinical involvement, a lot of back and forth with the parents. Alex has done all of this for free. The benefit for him was the data, right? He wants to help his own child. We both have autistic children. And he's done it for free. So vast amount, people talk, and everybody wants. He gets about 30 requests right now every week. And actually he's burned out, so he took a break. We have a lot of other projects. We're developing our own stool test right now. But that has showed us that it's possible to turn it around. We have, for example, a 30-year-old individual with autism that was in a group home. When I met him, he was barely talking. He was, talking like this, had a terrible rash on his back. He started with the gut balancing and the laser that we developed. And within 6 months, he's not qualifying for that group home anymore. And he just applied for a job. He's fully conversational. And we interviewed him. It's coming up on our channel. It's actually the son of a very prominent autism researcher that died. And I think I can say it. It's Dr. Bradstreet's son. I'm not sure if you know who that is, but he was the top autism researcher. He died in 2015. And so we treated his son and recovered him, basically. And there's a lot of other cases that we have. We constantly interview parents. Don't listen to me, listen to the parent experience of what happened to their child. But yeah, I know I haven't gotten into the juicy stuff yet that you're probably interested in, but no, I want to stop talking because I could talk all day about this.
No,
Hopefully it made sense.
It's truly remarkable stuff. Reversing autism through, an understanding of gut microbiome and neurochemistry. It's just an approach that traditional medicine hasn't taken. So by the juicy stuff, I'm assuming you're talking about the DMT and psychosis link and that type of thing. If you want to get into that next, or is there anything else you want to mention with that side of things, with the autism and the gut and that type of thing first?
Well, and I got a lot of criticism for this, I have a son with autism. He was vaccine injured, but we have to also remember there are a lot of children amongst us that are walking around that had the same vaccines, the same vaccine schedule, and they're fine, right? And they didn't get autism. So why not? If there's so much aluminum, and I don't want to take sides or whatever, but I'm just saying, why do they not have autism? I know we're getting there. 1 in 12 you mentioned. Maybe it is going to be everyone eventually. But nevertheless, there are kids walking around, they got all of the vaccines. What do they have that Jimmy over here, who's banging his head after the vaccine, doesn't have? And that's what we're interested in. What does he not have? And he has autism. So what can we do rather than like get lost in this idea, oh, it's the vaccines? What can we do for him? What does he not have that he had? And that clearly is something in the detoxification pathway. So we constantly have toxins that we're exposed to. We can get lost. There are 10,000 food chemicals approved by the EPA and FDA in this country. Many of them have not studied, but they're yet allowed to be used in the food supply. So you can look for the needle in the haystack, or you can just make the patient stronger. You can support their liver, you can support their detoxification pathways, hopefully through sulfation. That's how we do it. Sulfation support with the right sulfur, and it's not the sulforaphanes. It's not NAC. It's sodium thiosulfate. It's the active form of sulfur. You don't have to worry if you have a sulfur allergy. Sodium thiosulfate does not give you problems with that. I have a problem with Suox. I can't drink red wine. I have a sulfite sensitivity. This is not the same. The sodium thiosulfate is a different molecule. It's salt, and it's two sulfur ions, one with a double bond. It's a very reactive molecule, and it's very powerful in what it does. And so we think that's one of the missing links. But again, that just supports the liver to keep things out of the blood. And yeah, you can feel better. But the production center of the toxins is the microbiome. And that what ultimately needs to be addressed correctly. And that's what we do. But we first always support the detox pathways, reduce inflammation, and then we target the microbiome. If you do that too early, you throw things in there like probiotics, so you don't know what you're doing. These bacteria will go down, but they will release their toxins along the way. Okay. And a lot of parents are saying, this has made my kid worse, and they throw the towel. They're like, this is terrible. Even though it's the right path, we often see reactivity, which is actually guiding us. Hey, we're doing this. We need to go straight, into the fire. That's the right path. Why would you react if you take berberine, or any herb? You shouldn't. It's only because some bad guys are dying and they're releasing. It's like a car battery exploding in your gut, right? And so that's our approach. Now, the interesting stuff in regards to the DMT.
So for those at home, I might, I'll give my little spiel for those that aren't familiar with DMT. So DMT is the dimethyltryptamine, the chemical that's produced naturally in the brain, but also you've also probably heard about it through ayahuasca, and Joe Rogan sort of popularized this a few years ago now, and a lot of people have had experiences with this psychedelic at the higher levels when you take it as a plant medicine for these experience, and a lot of people find it very intense, but it can also be very healing. But your theory revolves around maybe that the body is naturally producing this chemical, but it might not be broken down. So some of these people with psychosis might almost be permanently stuck in a trip of sorts, again, related to enzymes. But I'm interested for you to give maybe your definitions and theories. And again, is this related to microbiome or environment, or what's the mechanisms that you're finding here?
Yeah, great question. So the early work, in regards to DMT, as far as I could look back, was in the 1970s, where they studied it and they proposed, hey, this is produced in the brain, but it was never really, verified. It was kind of like this myth that was going around for decades. But they knew that DMT somewhat is involved in psychosis, especially in schizophrenic patients, right? And then I was actually here at a university close to me, in University of Michigan. I talked to a great scientist who meanwhile went to some university in California, who proposed that DMT is produced in the pineal gland. right? That there's some abnormal mechanisms that lead to overproduction of DMT in the pineal gland. I'm like, okay, well, that was all there was to it. It wasn't really a kind of rock solid thing. So it's still, well, is it not? But what's clear is that DMT is able to be produced in the gut by bacteria. So, again, if we start from, let's say we have a huge amount of E. coli, for example, or Prevotella, right? We see that very often in autism, often even at 60, 70% when it should be 1%. So let's say we have this huge amount of Prevotella. Well, Prevotella is a bacteria that contains decarboxylate enzymes that, when you get the tryptophan coming in, very quickly can make tryptamines. And tryptamines, as you know, what I found in the urine, were always high. And tryptamine do have psychoactivity that can cause psychiatric symptoms because they work on the TAH receptors in the brain and indirectly modulate serotonin receptors. But here's the thing. When you have high levels of tryptamine in, in the circulating blood or made in the gut, what do you need to get to DMT from that point? All you need is 2 methyl groups, right? Di is 2-methyltryptamine. So if you start to add 2 methyl groups, and in fact, methylation is a mechanism in the body to get rid of things, right? To deactivate certain compounds, right? Like histamine. Methylhistamine is inactivated histamine. So you methylate histamine, you methylate dopamine, you methylate adrenaline to inactivate those compounds. However, when you do that, you form DMT. Now, usually the gut has very high activity of enzymes that break it down immediately, right? Further break it down. And that's why when you were talking about ayahuasca, what is it? It's 2 plants, right? One plant high in DMT, but the other plant is containing a compound that blocks the enzyme that breaks down the DMT, right? An MAO inhibitor. And so you want to block this enzyme that breaks down the DMT if you want to have a psychedelic experience with ayahuasca. And that's why a lot of people smoke just regular DMT because they bypass this MAO system. It's actually the MAOA gene that produces the enzyme that breaks it down. So here's the interesting part. When, let's say, we have this high Prevotella, the high tryptamines, and let's say it converted it to DMT, the thing is that this MAO enzyme, this gene, is an X-linked gene. So it's not on the Y gene, meaning boys only have 1, girls have 2. And if you have that gene, if you have a variation, or we call it polymorphism in that gene, it's not working. It's literally, you have maybe 20, 30% activity of this enzyme. And so this massive amount of DMT is coming in. And then because of, usually doesn't, get easily into the brain, but because of LPS, which opens up the blood-brain barrier, very easy access to the brain and immediate psychoactivity. And so that's one thing. Do we have evidence of that? Not really. We don't have evidence of DMT in autism. However, this mechanism is very straightforward. What do we have evidence of? We have evidence of, what happens with tryptamine. Turns into serotonin, right? Now, what happens if you methylate serotonin? You form a compound called bufotenin. And you probably have heard of that, of bufo, right? It's kind of the cousin of DMT. It has very potent psychoactivity too. It's not as hardcore as DMT, but it's a different type of psychedelic experience. If you listen to some trip reports, it's kind of the ego death or some other things, some contact with some whatever entities or spirits. But the bufotenin, there was a study in 2010 that had 15 autistic patients, 15 schizophrenics, and then a whole bunch of neurotypicals. And they found that there was elevations of bufotenin in the stool and the urine of literally all of the ones that are schizophrenic and autistic, and I think it was only one out of many of the neurotypicals. So it was a very clear difference that plays a key role of the bufotenin. And both bufotenin, serotonin, and dimethyltryptamine, they all work on the same receptor system, the 5-H2A receptor, which is the same receptor where psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, MDMA, no, actually not MDMA, but all of those act upon. And so, what was interesting is, I worked in a center before where we worked with neurofeedback systems, right? And it was fascinating because we had access to all of these kids, with autism, and we hooked them up to the QEEG. For those of you that don't know, it's a 19 lead, basically EEG that measures brain activity, brain frequency, brain waves. And like you and me talking right now, we have alpha and beta frequencies, going. And when you would dream, for example, and you measure your brain activity, you would actually find that you have gamma frequencies, elevations, and what we see when we hook these kids up, they had the same frequencies as if you were dreaming. And if you think about dreaming, it's a psychedelic experience, right? You tripping, right? In fact, that's where the term tripping is coming from. It's coming from tryptamine, because all psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, they all have tryptamine at its core, what builds it. That's why they say you're tripping. But and that was very interesting to see that actually the entire brain frequency is changing in their wake state, which I always correlate, with these kids having this access to this other consciousness. But it must mean that this other consciousness is always there. I imagine it like a radio frequency. The radio waves are always there. You just need to fine tune into that frequency, right? And all of a sudden you can hear it. And I think that's what happens if you change your brain frequency. You have access to that, I guess, oneness or one consciousness. And that's we communicate with some of these kids that are nonverbal, and they can answer questions that we have while we treat them, which is very helpful to get some insight. Autism is so difficult because we don't have feedback. We just look at the symptoms.
Yeah.
But a lot of them basically say, that they have this access to this consciousness, to this.
As we saw in the telepathy tapes, where they're asking some of these kids difficult questions, and they're saying, "Where are you getting these answers?" And I think the response was something like that: "We're tapping into this universal information field," which is certainly the feeling you do get a lot of the time when you have meaningful psychedelic experiences.
Correct. However, you also have bad experiences, right?
Yes.
And so unfortunately, what they don't talk about in the telepathy tapes is the horrible experiences, the bad trips that these kids have, the kids that bang their heads at 2:00 in the morning, or kids that are anxious or freaked out and terrified. Why?
Yeah, and I was going to say, if someone's having a bad trip, it's all about set and setting. And have you heard much, or I think even in the telepathy tapes, I talking about kids like being out in nature and on the hills and that type of thing, versus what we do. Kids like being out in nature when they're a lot of these autistic kids, versus maybe the way we treat some of this psychosis and autism, locking them in rooms or whatnot, which is the worst environment if you're having a bad trip type of thing. So have you given that sort of all much thought?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. A lot of kids love to spend all day outside. And for some reason, a lot of kids also have a high affinity for being in water. I yet have to figure out why. There's something about possibly shielding them from certain frequencies, or it has a very calming effect for the children. It's interesting. I'm not sure if you've ever watched Stranger Things or not, but it's a very similar phenomenon there, where they hook 11, that little girl, up to all of these electrodes because they want to do some remote viewing on the Russians, right? Some kind of counterintelligence thing. And they immersed her in water in order to see, the other person, the whatever Russians or the other side. And so I yet have to see what it is with the water that does that. But at the end of the day, I'm not a fan of this, ability. To be honest, I don't really care for it. It's interesting, great, but at the end of the day, I want these children to speak. That's how I grew up.
Yeah.
It's kind of how I see life. You grow up, you procreate, you marry, you have children, and then you die. It's maybe very simple, but right now, if the kids have telepathy, but I die, guess who else dies? They will die if nobody else helps them for the rest of their lives, and they might get abused. So we want to bring them back. We don't think it's a natural state to be necessarily for these kids because they're non-functional. And I just can't get it into my head that this is okay.
Yeah.
So I don't, if they're telepathic or not, it's interesting, but it's not my research interest right now.
So I've got a bit of a theory around the water and the calming and the bad trips and psychosis as well. I think, as you mentioned, the gamma versus alpha and beta states, and oftentimes if you're having a nice psychedelic experience, it's the jolt of coming back to reality in this experience, that it's the chaos, and that's what I think they're maybe stuck between two frequencies or places or whatever, which first, that sensory deprivation tank allows them to tune in and relaxes the body and that type of thing, versus being stuck between two states of chaos and you're not sure what's real and what's not, maybe. So
that's a very good point. Yeah. And plus we don't know if you have a chronic, ayahuasca is what, 6 hours, smoking DMT is 8 minutes. But imagine years of experience, how this would influence your behavior, your actions. And so there's a lot yet, that we have to learn in that regards. But I mean, we do see good results. We see a reduction of hyperactivity. We see more awareness, eye contact, speech coming back, all of that. So that's what drives us. And we let the research into the telepathy up to some other experts like Dr. Powell, which is fine. It's just there's only so much you can do, right?
Yeah. Just the last thing I'll ask about the telepathy. Have you heard any evidence that people that have maybe been healed, have they lost their abilities, or is there anything one way or another in terms of that?
That's a great question. And so far, I have to be honest, I don't know.
Okay.
The several patients that we have recovered, like where we just talked to one today, they actually lost the diagnosis, but child was 5 years old. So, he didn't even have a chance to let us know if he had that ability or not. And parents certainly weren't aware of any of that. The 30-year-old that we've recovered, he certainly didn't have any recollection of having telepathic abilities or anything like that. So I don't know. I would think that yes, they would to an extent lose that ability, lose it, or in a sense, it's not really a loss because what you're gaining is life, right?
Yes.
Communication and survival and independence and freedom. So yeah, I would think on a biochemical thing, yes, absolutely, they would lose it because it doesn't mean they're not smart or whatever. They always have this affinity probably for having higher levels of introversion or perception and of the environment, but I don't think to that extent that you actually tripping and be disconnected from your reality.
So many things going through my head at the moment about if we were able to heal, someone maybe 30 years old and then again give them a DMT trip experience once they're healed and say, is this the place you were stuck in? And imagine if you could, first-hand experiences and the type of research that hopefully we're going to get to in the coming years.
Right.
And I'm not sure if you've heard of the DMT X guys that are doing the extended state DMT. intravenous with experienced trippers, and they're trying to map out the
Rick
DMT way.
Strassman.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rick Strassman, the DMT spirit molecule, right? I read that book many years ago, and what was interesting, I think, with that is when they did these experiments with the IV DMT, is that some of these patients came and they met the same entities on the other
Yes.
side, which is mind blowing, right? So I think that that's very interesting. So there's so much that we don't know on the other side, but
So
there's
yeah, just the one thing I was going to add. So the research I was talking about with this extended state IV trip over an hour was based on that original research, but this is very recent, where they're getting guys that are now experienced that are able to describe what they're seeing while they're in a DMT trip, and the entities they're seeing, and the same entities, and the rooms and the geometry. So we're starting to paint a picture of what this is with multiple people doing it at once and all sorts of
oh, wow.
fantastic stuff. So I'll send you a link afterwards for some of that research if you like.
What I did see, that's something that is similar, and you've probably seen this, and I can send that to you. I think he was a Russian guy. Maybe he was Russian, maybe not. But what he did is, he was guiding patients or administering or giving people DMT, and he has like 100 clients or something. And what he did is one day he had this red laser,
Yeah.
and did
Yeah.
you see that? And
Yeah.
it was shining on the wall, and he's like tripping on DMT, and he's like looking at the laser, and he's like, "What the fuck? I see a code, like a matrix code running
Yes.
through it." He's like, "This is crazy. I'm tripping." But then he asked a friend. He said, "Do you see this shit?" And the guy said, "Yes, this is crazy. I see the matrix code, and it's ever changing, in this red laser." And then he's like, "This is unbelievable," And then he had one person after the other come and look at this laser light, like they're glancing at it from the side, and they're like, "Yes, they see a code running through there." And if you're not on DMT, you don't see it. So what does that mean?
There
Are
was
we
a
living
I think
simulated?
it might have been the Danny Jones podcast. He had the DMT expert on. They spoke about this for 5 hours the other day, and I haven't watched the full thing yet, but I saw some of the clips. But that's on my to-do list because we do have friends that have the lasers, and yeah, maybe I'll try that out and report back firsthand. But I know it's getting late. But the last thing I wanted to ask you about was: have you done much research around, maybe adrenochrome and the collect? Is there a connection to psychosis? Is there another mechanism there where people may have too high levels of that? Because we have been covering some of the stuff around child trafficking and some of this darker stuff that's coming to light in the last few years as well.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research into that. As you know, there was a psychiatrist in Canada. His name was Abraham Hoffer, and he was in the 50s. He had the largest psychiatric center in North America, and he was very interested in schizophrenia. And he came up with this proposal that it's the adrenochrome that causes schizophrenia. And so what is adrenochrome? It's very simple. It's oxidized adrenaline. So when you have excess adrenaline and you can't break it down, oftentimes it's linked to this gene called COMT, catecholamine methyltransferase. If you have a homozygous variation in there and it's reduced in activity, then you have just high levels of adrenaline. And in the presence of free radicals, the adrenaline oxidizes into adrenochrome. And that has been shown, yes, to cause profound psychoactivity. However, it's also been shown to stop mitosis. And so it's a very, very potent anti-cancer, anti-aging agent. So, you have to remember, people with schizophrenia, and I think I read somewhere, up to 80% of adult schizophrenic patients smoke. Yet there's no reported cases of lung cancer in the literature that you can find with somebody with schizophrenia with lung cancer. Why? How long do schizophrenics live? Very long. They live longer than a regular person. They live with psychosis and schizophrenia, which sucks, but they live long lives, and they usually look very good, very young. So in regards to child trafficking and the adrenochrome hypothesis, oh, absolutely. And I always look at it as the kind of you have crack, cocaine, and heroin. right? Never done any of them. But crack is kind of like the cheap stuff, right? That would be synonymous with lab-produced adrenochrome. You can order adrenochrome right now from a lab, for research purposes. You can get that, but it's produced in a lab. And so the problem is it has a lot of stuff in there to stabilize it, right? Heavy metals, stabilizers, a lot of crap in there. So that's like your crack. Then you have the next thing would be like the cocaine kind of purity would be harvested adrenochrome, which is actually, from blood, from humans.
Yeah, we won't
But
get into
still,
too dark stuff, so we can maybe still put this on YouTube. But I think a lot of people, I've covered this before about adrenochrome and that. But yeah,
and then you would have that, you still need to preserve that blood and put stabilizers in, but it's better than it's synthetic. And at the end, you have live blood, right? Which is pure. And that's when you get into the satanic rituals, killings, and things like that. So yeah, I've done a lot of research into that. You look into, in fact, it's very much linked to the DMT. And, not to digress too much, but I put this picture up once of, Alice in Wonderland, where you see, what's his name? The caterpillar, Abatom or Abeloth
can't
or
remember.
whatever.
Yeah.
And if you look at this caterpillar, he's smoking something, right? Sitting on that mushroom. And what he's actually smoking, if you look at DMT, now if you look at bufotenin on a chemical structure, it looks like a caterpillar. And then next to him is the white rabbit, right, from Alice in Wonderland. And if you look at him, he has dilated pupils. He's very stressed out. There's always this time, he's late, and he's on adrenochrome. Because if you look at the adrenochrome as a chemical structure, it looks like a rabbit, right?
Yes.
So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful in any way, but yes, I do believe there's a huge, huge thing about this. I think it's real, and people produce it naturally. However, if you want to harvest it from someone, you need to scare the living hell out of that person to raise the adrenaline. The scarier, the better, which includes pain and, torture.
Yeah.
And then you harvest it and you drain their blood. So if it,
Yeah, it's
don't have
dark stuff, and I'm really hoping with everything that's coming out lately and a lot of the top podcasts starting to touch on this and bring it to light, that we are going to see an end to a lot of this child stuff and child abuse and this adrenochrome industry, which a few
in the
years ago,
tunnels.
yeah.
In the
Beautiful.
tunnels.
Well, that's been absolutely amazing. I'll put all the links to follow your research and your protocols and then on socials down below. But any final thoughts for people at home or things we haven't touched on you think are important?
Pray for our children. Let's hope we can recover them, because that's what we owe them. We have really, as humanity, fucked up.
Yeah.
With all of this stuff. We have failed our children with all of this garbage of power and money. And now that all of this is coming to light, that needs to be the priority. Not the economy, not any wars, not Mars. We need to help those that were injured right now. There's millions just in this country, and there's many, many more millions around the world. We need to find solutions. We need to start talking about solutions, and because that's the least we can do for these children. Because otherwise, we're not getting anywhere. So pray for them, pray for those that do, try to help, and praise for those that trying to expose all this. Robert Kennedy, I have a lot of hopes that he and his team and Trump will do the right thing. So it's our last chance, I think, to save humanity, really, future generations. So a lot of praying I do every day. And if I fail, so be it. At least I tried. So, but thank you for all that you do, Alex, to raise awareness, and God bless you too. So
Yeah, thank you very much. You're doing amazing work. So you'll be in our thoughts and prayers as well. And I'm also very hopeful, and it feels like, yeah, this next few years is going to be very important. And that's why we're doing these episodes. So love it. We'll have to have you on again in future, mate. But all the best, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Have a great night.